A pair of horn-rimmed spectacles rests in the damp grass near a remote culvert on the outskirts of Chicago. Beneath the murky water lies the body of 14-year-old Bobby Franks. It is May of 1924, and the brutal discovery shatters the illusion of a meticulously planned, perfect crime. Two brilliant minds, driven by a toxic mix of arrogance and dark philosophy, have just ignited one of the most explosive legal battles in American history. The question echoing through the city is not who committed the murder, but whether the state will snap their necks at the end of a rope. The killers were Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, 19 and 18 years old respectively. Born into immense wealth and gifted with staggering intellects, the teenagers viewed themselves as Nietzschean supermen, entirely exempt from the moral constraints of ordinary society. They murdered Bobby Franks not for revenge and not for the ransom they demanded, but simply for the thrill of the experience. They sought to prove their absolute superiority by committing an unsolvable crime, leaving behind a corpse and a city paralyzed by fear. But their intellectual arrogance proved to be their absolute undoing. The dropped spectacles found near the body featured a rare, patented hinge mechanism. Detectives quickly traced the unique frames to only 3 people in the Chicago area, one of whom was Nathan Leopold. When investigators pulled the young men in for questioning, their airtight alibis rapidly disintegrated under scrutiny. Within days, the brilliant supermen confessed, detailing the cold-blooded kidnapping and the lethal blows from a chisel with chilling, emotionless precision. The public outrage was immediate and deafening. Mobs gathered outside the courthouse, demanding swift and brutal retribution. State's Attorney Robert E. Crowe, a formidable prosecutor with political ambitions, promised the citizens of Chicago that Leopold and Loeb would hang. The evidence was insurmountable. The confessions were signed, and the crime was premeditated murder of a child. The gallows seemed completely inevitable. Facing certain execution, the desperate families of the defendants turned to the most famous defense attorney in the nation, Clarence Darrow. Darrow was a legendary legal tactician and a lifelong militant opponent of capital punishment. Taking the case was a monumental risk, pitting his reputation against a tidal wave of public hatred. Darrow knew that placing these 2 unrepentant, wealthy teenagers in front of 12 ordinary citizens would result in a remarkably swift death sentence. At their arraignment, the formal reading of the criminal charging document, the boys initially entered a standard plea of not guilty. But Darrow, orchestrating his defense with surgical precision, executed a shocking reversal just as the trial was set to begin. He withdrew the not guilty plea and formally pleaded his clients guilty to the charges of murder and kidnapping for ransom. A collective gasp rippled through the Chicago courtroom. This calculated legal maneuver fundamentally altered the battlefield. By pleading guilty, Darrow entirely bypassed a jury trial. The fate of Leopold and Loeb no longer rested with 12 enraged peers, but solely in the hands of Chief Justice John R. Caverly. Darrow gambled that a seasoned judge, steeped in the law and mindful of historical precedent, would be more receptive to a complex intellectual argument for mercy than an emotional jury out for blood. The proceeding transformed from a trial of facts into a mitigation hearing. This specialized legal phase occurs after a guilty plea, where the defense presents evidence to lessen the severity of the sentence, while the prosecution argues for maximum penalty. The burden of proof essentially shifted. Darrow did not have to prove his clients were innocent. He had to prove they did not deserve to die. State's Attorney Crowe opened the hearing with a relentless assault. He meticulously reconstructed the horrific timeline of the murder, leaving no brutal detail unexamined. Crowe presented the rented Willie's Night automobile used for the kidnapping, the typewriter used to draft the ransom note, and the hydrochloric acid poured over the victim's face to obscure his identity. The prosecution painted a portrait of cold, calculating, and irredeemable monsters. To establish premeditation, Crowe called a steady stream of witnesses. Hardware store clerks testified to the purchase of the chisel and the rope. Acquaintances recounted the boys' arrogant demeanor in the days following the disappearance. The prosecutor methodically built a fortress of aggravating factors designed to corner Judge Caverly into handing down the ultimate punishment. Throughout the prosecution's grueling presentation, Leopold and Loeb sat at the defense table, frequently whispering to each other and smirking at the journalists. Their chilling lack of remorse permeated the courtroom atmosphere, turning the public even further against them. Crow seized upon their impassive behavior, pointing to their smiles as absolute proof of their inherent, irredeemable evil. When the defense finally took the floor, Darrow initiated a profound paradigm shift. He introduced a defense strategy previously unseen in a major American murder trial. Darrow sought to admit extensive psychiatric and medical testimony to explain the underlying causes of the crime. He argued that to understand the murder, the court had to understand the diseased minds that conceived it. Darrow called a battery of alienists, the era's term for psychiatrists, to the witness stand. Dr. William Healy, a prominent expert in juvenile behavior, detailed the boys' abnormal psychological development. Healy testified to a toxic symbiosis between the two, a shared delusion where Loeb's sociopathic drive for criminal dominance fused perfectly with Leopold's desperate need for Loeb's approval. The medical testimony plunged deeper into the defendants' psyches. Dr. Bernard Gluck testified that despite their towering IQs, Leopold and Loeb suffered from severe emotional retardation. He argued that the immense wealth and isolated upbringing of the teenagers had completely severed them from normal human empathy. The experts painted a picture of two broken machines, functioning brilliantly on an intellectual level, but entirely devoid of a moral compass. State's Attorney Crow fiercely objected to this entire line of defense. He argued that Darrow was attempting to introduce an insanity defense through the back door. Crow maintained a rigid legal binary. If the defendants were legally insane, they belonged in an asylum. If they were sane enough to plan a complex kidnapping, they were entirely culpable and belonged on the gallows. Judge Caverly's decision to overrule Crow's objections and admit the psychiatric testimony set a monumental legal precedent. It formally established that psychological evaluations and environmental factors could be considered as mitigating circumstances in a capital case. The courtroom had evolved from a simple arena of facts into a complex laboratory of human behavior. In a desperate bid to reclaim the narrative, the prosecution brought forward their own medical experts. These state-sponsored alienists testified that Leopold and Loeb were perfectly sane, fully aware of the difference between right and wrong, and entirely responsible for their actions. They dismissed the defense's theories of emotional retardation as pseudo-scientific excuses designed to shield wealthy murderers from the consequences of their brutality. The hearing devolved into a grueling battle of the experts, bogging down in dense medical jargon and conflicting psychological theories. The sweltering heat of the Chicago summer mirrored the rising tension within the courtroom walls. Every day the press dissected the testimonies, fueling a national debate over the validity of psychiatry in the realm of criminal justice. As the weeks dragged on, the time finally arrived for closing arguments. State's Attorney Crow delivered a thunderous, impassioned demand for execution. He labeled Leopold and Loeb as cowardly assassins and venomous snakeweeds that needed to be uprooted from society. Crow argued that sparing their lives would be a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, an insult to the grieving family of Bobby Franks, and a dangerous signal to future criminals. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew suffocatingly tense as the prosecution rested. The families of the victim and the defendants braced themselves for the final act. The entire weight of the defense, the lives of two young men, and the philosophical burden of capital punishment now rested squarely on the drooping shoulders of Clarence Darrow. Darrow rose slowly from the defense table. He did not begin with a booming declaration, but with a quiet, solemn acknowledgement of the tragedy. He spent 12 grueling hours over 2 days delivering his closing argument. Darrow did not attempt to minimize the unspeakable horror of the murder, nor did he ask the judge to forgive the defendants for their monstrous actions. Instead, Darrow shifted the focus toward a profound philosophy of determinism. He argued that Leopold and Loeb were the inevitable products of their environment, their genetics, and the societal trauma of the recent World War. He painted them as victims of their own broken minds, driven by forces they could neither understand nor control. The defense attorney asked the court to consider the infinite chain of events that leads a human being to commit the unthinkable. Darrow's voice swelled as he turned his rhetorical fire against the concept of retributive justice. He challenged the state's right to take a human life in the name of the law. He asked Judge Caverly if hanging these two boys would restore the life of Bobby Franks, or if it would merely add 2 more corpses to an endless cycle of blood and cruelty. He framed the execution not as justice, but as legalized, premeditated murder by the state. In the final hours of his speech, tears streamed down Darrow's deeply lined face. His voice dropped to an exhausted, emotional whisper. He pleaded not just for the lives of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, but for the future of humanity. He urged the judge to look past the hatred of the mob and to deliver a ruling rooted in understanding, charity, and mercy, rather than primitive vengeance. The courtroom sat in absolute, stunned silence as Darrow concluded his masterpiece. The impact of his words hung heavy in the stifling air. Weeks later, the tension reached its absolute peak as Judge John R. Caverly finally convened the court to deliver his highly anticipated ruling. The nation held its breath, waiting to see if the legendary attorney's desperate gamble had succeeded. Judge Caverly acknowledged the brutal and calculated nature of the crime, stating that the murder of Bobby Franks demanded severe punishment. However, he ultimately rejected the prosecution's demand for the death penalty. Citing the defendant's youth as the primary mitigating factor, the judge sentenced Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb to life in prison for the murder, plus an additional 99 years for the kidnapping. The immediate aftermath was a storm of conflicting emotions. State's Attorney Crowe was visibly furious, viewing the sentence as a gross subversion of justice fueled by the defendant's vast wealth. The public remained deeply divided, with many expressing outrage that the killers had cheated the hangman. Meanwhile, Leopold and Loeb were quietly transported to Joliet prison, their arrogant dreams of superiority permanently extinguished behind iron bars. The legacy of the 1924 hearing reverberated far beyond the walls of the Chicago courthouse. Darrow's radical strategy fundamentally altered the trajectory of the American judicial system. It cemented the vital role of psychological evidence in criminal defense, forcing courts to grapple with the complex realities of mental health and human behavior. Furthermore, his impassioned plea for mercy ignited a lasting, profound debate over the morality of capital punishment, leaving an indelible mark on the unending pursuit of justice.